Hey everyone, welcome back to the second half of 2017 book video. It's taken me a little while. I actually came down with two more bugs after I got sick twice earlier. Nothing as bad as the first two, but I did lose my voice. The last time was I was actually trying to record this video. On the second attempt, it just completely went out. So I'm going to try to shoot this before my wife gets home. That way I can finally get this one out there. Knock it out of the queue. If you haven't seen the first part, I discussed, let's see here, a biography on Alcibiades, another book, The Social War, 91 to 88, a history of the Italian insurgency against the Roman Republic, The Tyrants of Syracuse, The Chronicles of Theophanes, Rommel's Infantry Tactics, Poilu, the World War I Notebooks of Corporal Louis Bartas, and that's where it ended, and this is the remaining titles that I read. This is probably the most fiction I've ever read, so I will go through those first, and then nonfiction, the history. First up is, I was watching MT Books channel, and he was reviewing, I don't think it was this one. I think it was another one by the same author, but this one is Lathe of Heaven. After he reviewed, the name escapes me. He reviewed one of Ursula Le Guin's books, and he said if you like this, you should check this book out and some of her other stuff. So I asked my wife, because she's got a large library, and she said, no, I don't have that one, but I have the Lathe of Heaven. And I want to say he also discussed Lathe of Heaven. This is about a man named George Orr who discovers that he can change the world around him while he sleeps. So he can't really control what happens, and only he initially is aware that the world around him is changing. He goes and sees a psychologist who initially doesn't believe him, but once he puts George under, he can see the world shift. If you're near George, he's the epicenter of change. You retain your memory of the previous world. So in an interview, she said that she doesn't view the psychologist as a villain, and that's largely true because what he tries is to improve the world. But along the way, he kind of gives himself some perks. Suddenly he's the head of a prestigious department. He's got a really nice office instead of this little hole in the wall. And the problem comes in that George wants to try to either get rid of this power or control himself, not hand the reins off to someone else. And he gets increasingly irritated the more Haber, the doctor that's helping him, starts to change the world into what George views as for solely his benefit. What's interesting, though, is the novel starts off kind of in a weird scene, and you're playing catch-up to what's going on, but it's not so confusing that you're completely lost. It's just a real interesting beginning, and the end wraps around to that, and I really like when stories do that, kind of reward you for following along and paying attention. But yeah, it gets pretty surreal by the end as George loses, doesn't so much lose power as the more worked up he gets and the more agitated, the crazier things get as he dreams, and so the world just goes nuts. Great visuals in this. Really good writing. I am going to read some more stuff by her. George was kind of annoying, but he's supposed to be that way. He's supposed to be malleable and weak-willed, and that's how Haber is able to take such control over his life, and with very loose threats get George to do whatever he wants until close towards the end. But he becomes a semi-likable character. He comes around as you'd expect. He really just wants to do what's right, and he's putting his faith in a guy that, while he might mean well, his actions slowly veer away from that course. But yeah, it's an entertaining book. Like I said, some really good imagery in it. Kind of on the opposite end is this one I finally finished. It's George R.R. Martin's Dying of the Light. I read this was his first published novel, and really the star of this book is the setting. There's a world that is not in any orbit. It's been discovered several times throughout the millennia and slowly forgotten as the years creep on. A discoverer might see it, make a note of it, and then that's it. Well, at one point, it gets into a brief orbit of 7 suns that were artificially placed to look like a wheel. I want to say like a pinwheel. And all the outer colonies get together and they decide that they're going to celebrate and show off by each putting a city on this planet that is for, I think it's 50 years, going to be within the orbit of these suns. The book is set right at the end of this. Most of the people have gone home. The planet's only got 1 or 2 years left of sunlight, and at that point it will be so far out of orbit that even the 7 stars won't be able to light it up. And Dirk, that name gets me, Dirk Tellurian, gets summoned to the planet by his ex-girlfriend through a whisper jewel. And he goes without hesitation. Well, he kind of hesitates, but what you're going to find is Dirk's irritating. Dirk goes, sees her, she's with a coworker, she is studying the fauna on the planet, because each colony not only founded a city, but they brought unique plant and wildlife, and so she's studying how those interact with one another, because it's just the first time it's happened. He also finds out she's married to a man from a planet that is clan-based, and she has this, not gauntlet, but a brace on her arm to signify she's married. He comes to find out that's more kind of like property. Her husband supposedly is a little more progressive than that, doesn't view her as it, but the other people in that society do. It's very boring. Dirk is irritating throughout the entire book. He never comes around. And the writing is very live journalish. You know, if Dirk sees something, the writing will be something along the lines of, and Dirk lets out a smirk before he grabs Gwen by the arm and rushes off to his new idea. You're going, what the hell is that? That's low-tier writing. What is interesting, though, is each colony, Martin touches on each colony's history briefly, and those are really interesting. You get these glimpses that at one point there was a separation between Earth and the colonies. There was a civil war, and then there was a slave race that came and started using genetically modified creatures to enslave the colonies, and there's just these wild stories. And as Gwen takes Dirk on a tour of the planet, in each colony, she kind of tells him the backstory of what's going on. That wraps into Gwen's husband, who's uncovering the truth about his planet society, because they have all this folklore about demons and acid rain, and he's tying that into the historical events of the slavers that tried to take the planet, and so his people had to go underground. That's all very interesting. But Gwen, Dirk, I forgot her husband's name. Let me see if it says it. No. And her coworker are just the most unlikable people you can imagine. Like I said, the writing is borderline juvenile at points. Definitely a first start for him. The setting is wonderful. I wish the characters and the writing was up to par with that. So yeah, the history, the culture, the setting, that's fantastic. But the characters are so grating that I almost didn't finish the book. And the final fiction book I read was We the Underpeople by Cordwainer Smith. Cordwainer Smith is a very interesting character. He wrote one of the earliest or the earliest book on psychological warfare that was used in war colleges. He was the son of a diplomat, and I want to say he knew Mao Zedong when he was a kid, and that's where he got his nickname because his father served in China. So Cordwainer Smith, what's his real name? He became an expert on Chinese. That's why you see some writing here. Let me try to find his real name. He's also, rumor has it, the subject of the rocket-propelled couch, if you've ever read The 50-Minute Hour. It's a book on psychoanalysis. Well, this goes over the history of the stories, because why those are interesting is that he wrote these over several years throughout different publications, and it turns out they were all related. It was after reading them in their totality that people realized they were reoccurring characters and themes, and he might write one story 3 years later that picks up where a previous one left off, even though they are standalone. So there's basically two themes. There's the rediscovery of mankind, and there's the Underpeople. The Underpeople are these animal-human hybrids that are the worker class, basically. The humans live in this utopia that is enforced upon them by the instrumentality of man. And so this is a sprawling collection of stories that goes from when the Underpeople initially begin to realize that they can break free from their bonds, all the way to a little bit about the planet Nostralia, which has its own book. And that book is comprised of two separate stories that were published in different magazines that were standalone and eventually were combined into one. Nostralia is, I think they call it New Australia. It's set on a planet that has this precious mineral that allows you to live for a long time. And everyone on the planet, it's kind of like Sparta, ancient Sparta. Everyone lives poor and frugal because they don't want the money to corrupt. And this one guy, kind of on a lark, ends up making a lot of money. And so that's a whole side story that's interesting on its own that ties into characters that are sprinkled throughout these other stories. Some of them, in case you've read some of his previous work, is The Dead Lady of Clowntown, Under Old Earth, Mother Hitten's Little Kittens, Alpha Ralpha Boulevard, The Ballad of Lost Samel and Nostralia. So these tie together in that Mother Hitten's Little Kittens is related to Nostralia, The Ballad of Lost Samel is also related to Alpha Ralpha Boulevard, and The Dead Lady of Clowntown is related to basically all this in that it kicks off the Underpeople's revolution. It's also, the umbrella is the rediscovery of man, and that is when humans decide that they don't want to be forced to be happy. So the instrumentality of man is realizing there are suicides going on, and there are these seedy parts of the world where people are doing drugs. And that's when they decide they will slowly pull back some of their advancements, such as medicine and old age. They'll allow people to get sick. They'll let them die younger. They're not going to go too far with it. You know, they even say they'll have a few auto accidents, but not too many. So they're slowly pulling back to make people feel their lives are a little more dangerous, a little more exciting. There's one instance where someone learns French instantly, and someone else learns French, and they meet together, and because they both know French, they can talk to each other. And they were given, old French newspapers so they can feel French. It's things like that. It's kind of out there science fiction of that era, the 60s, 70s. Very entertaining. Like there's spirals that are miles and miles high that former emperors of mankind used to have their triumphs going to the very top. And when they do, they find old computers there that, you know, for that era were modern, but now we think of them as old. There's different layers and levels. There's robots. There's talking animals. There's all that sort of stuff. And it's just very entertaining. So I would highly recommend We the Underpeople. I have Nostralia, which will include parts 1 and 2. So I'm going to read that. And the other collection I want to say is called The Rediscovery of Man. And it includes the remainder of the stories. Some of these, but some of the others. Because they overlap, when you get some of his collections, you're going to get a few stories that are the same. Okay, moving on. In terms of nonfiction, I read one e-book because I got it for $1, which was a really good price, and that is Great Battles of the Classical Greek World. This covers the Peloponnesian War, Part 1, Part 2 is Spartan, excuse me, the Spartan, Battle of Chaeronea, Nemea. Part 3 is Siege Warfare. Part 4 is Greco-Persian conflicts, and Part 5 is his conclusions. What's interesting in this is that you get some battles that are pretty well known, like the battles of Mantinea, the Siege of Plataea. But you get things like the Battle of the Long Walls of Corinth. Now, I'd never heard that before, and essentially most cities that were large had harbors. Athens had one as well, and they would connect their harbors to the main city through very, very, very long walls. Well, in this battle, Spartans were able to puncture a hole through the wall, set up a barricade to separate the harbor from the city. And so there's a fight in between this narrow stretch of very high walls. And I've never heard of that battle before, and it was really enjoyable to read it. So while you do get a lot of really well-known ones in here, you do get a few odds and ends sprinkled throughout. I want to say this is also the book that spoke on Helots that escaped Sparta and got involved in this civil war in North Africa. Um, let's see. The sieges are okay. Nothing too interesting there. The Greco-Persian conflicts are pretty much ones you've heard about before, although he does give some overalls and some conclusions that are pretty interesting. Pretty good background information before each conflict. There is a general bit of history before he starts to explain hoplites, phalanxes, sarissas, the differences and things like that. But yeah, this was pretty good. This was a dollar or $1.99. Pen and Sword books have a bunch of typos, and this one has a few as well, although it's really on the better side. And so when you buy their books, though, they're 25 to 30, but their ebooks, they regularly put them for 99 cents to $1.99. So definitely recommend that one. I do like collections of battles and events. It's a real quick read. You can just read one battle, stop, read another battle, stop. So yeah, that one's recommended. This is a pen and sword book. Hellenistic and Roman naval wars. This one's not bad. I never read too much about naval battles before, and what's impressive is just the size of some of the battles during the successor wars of Alexander the Great. I mean, each faction had hundreds and hundreds of ships, and you contrast that to the early Middle Ages when 30, 40 is impressive, and I think in a battle between the Danes and Swedes, there was like 300, and that was massive. But at this point, just Demetrius, Antigonus's son, had hundreds and hundreds. Ptolemy of Egypt had 150 to 250. Just absolutely massive naval battles. Talks about the evolution of naval conflict, the evolution of the boats from the triremes to the quaremes. Some of the novelty ships, like Lysimachus's boat that was so big it was basically useless, but it was just to awe everyone. Demetrius had a massive ship as well that you couldn't do much with it, and that's what they found is the capital ship would be so big it was just a massive target, but it was impressive. And little tidbits that you don't hear much about, such as when Cleopatra was ruling Egypt, Egypt still had, I think, 200 boats in their navy, and they had about 50 that patrolled the harbor. So you get some stats that you don't hear about elsewhere. And yeah, I mean, John Granger writes a lot about the Seleucids, so he's a good writer. Pen and Sword Books has its problems, but if you're ever interested or have ever been interested in naval warfare, I would definitely give this one a read. It really presses home the cost of how much the ships were to run, how many crews people took to crew a ship. I think it was 300. So when there's a loss of a fleet, those are thousands of lives. There's a fair bit about when Rome was fighting Carthage. They were losing tens of thousands of soldiers because Carthage was superior at sea for quite a while. And if it said Rome lost a fleet, in a general history, what he's saying is when they lost a fleet, they lost tens of thousands of soldiers. And if you would read in another history that didn't emphasize naval warfare, you'd wonder why people were getting so worked up in Rome if they lost a fleet because they might have won a land battle. Well, yeah, they might have won a land battle, but they lost, and it's not just Rome, it's all the allied cities that were helping her. So yeah, it really presses home the scale and why it was only the massive states that had huge navies. And even that some of the smaller ones still had a few that patrolled for pirates. So recommended that as well. And last is Celsus's On the True Doctrine, a discourse against the Christians. This was one of the two books, along with Porphyry, that made the biggest impact that we still have. Celsus is largely intact because Origen, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, he was a Christian apologist that responded to this book, I guess about 60 years after it was written, but he used direct quotes, so that's how they have almost all of his book intact, because he didn't just, well, sometimes he paraphrased, but for the most part, he would directly quote what Celsus said, and then he would write his rebuttal. So because of that, we have quite a bit of this. And it really presses home how, and I'll say pagan, but the fact of the matter is they weren't pagan. They were just people who did what they did, and the Christians were the ones that were strange. we tend to think of religion largely as separate in our lives, and what this stresses is that no, honoring gods was just something you did. Me getting something, taking a sip of water is what I'm just going to do. You honoring the gods is just something you do. So to have a group that doesn't was seen as very strange. And he has problems with Judaism, but the Romans in general, they revered antiquity. So to them, Jewish people were old. Or Judaism was old, so to them it had a basis in something. So they might have clashes every now and then. For the most part, they left them alone. There's quite a few direct letters in here where it's someone saying, I've heard that your city is oppressing Jewish people. They are friends of Rome. Leave them alone or exempt them from military service. So it stresses that it wasn't always an antagonistic attitude. But for the Christians, he presses home that he thinks they're basically heretical Jews, that they have turned their back on their forefathers, which is seen as a double insult because your ancestors were everything, and that you're basically turning your back on them, forsaking their knowledge. And so there's so many taboo things right there that they just, this group is just strange. Like, what are you doing? And what also very much frustrates them is that Christians, and Origen agrees with them, won't explain their position. He said, when I go to a woman and I'll ask them, they'll just say it's based on faith. Well, Origen, what he says is, at the time, they were simpler. They didn't have our doctrines. Well, basically, the doctrines came about in rebuttals to people like this. And they were further refined later on, and that's what you basically have in the teachings now, are answers to these questions. At the time, they didn't have answers. So when someone would ask the question, and someone would say, well, it's just on faith. And it would drive them crazy. They view them as sky worshipers because they were always praying to the heavens. They quote some more salacious bits in here. Early Christian writers do as well. There were some sects that were very strange. They mix Gnosticism in, and a lot of them retained old pagan rituals. And so other early Christian writers were trying to kind of push them back, saying that's not us, that's just some weird groups, and they had some very, very weird practices. They viewed them as, Celsus views them as essentially copying other religions, and he goes through these long lists of examples of, a virgin birth is not new, resurrection is not new, heaven is not new, hell's not new. For Gnosticism, divine wisdom's not new. Like, none of this is new. The story of, this parable is actually this, and this. You're just taking our stuff and then calling us dumb while not answering questions. There's also little side bits of how there was a guy who was a rich shipbuilder, decided that he had the true word, the true wisdom, and created this massive sect that eventually had to get stamped out by other Christians. So just very interesting stuff. If you're into how religions form, pagan thought about early Christianity, which is very interesting because it's a tipping point. And at this point, there's still plenty of pagans. Like, people really underestimate how popular paganism was towards the end. There were still hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shrines, especially in Western Europe. It was still very popular. This was written well before its fall, but Celsus sees this group that's gaining a popularity, and he just doesn't understand why. So he's trying to refute them. I want to get Porphyry next so I can get kind of that's supposed to be the better, more fleshed out view. Celsus is well read in Jewish doctrine, but Porphyry is apparently much better read in it. So if you just want some early thoughts and to hear about some of the weirder sects that got stamped out pretty quickly, definitely give this a read. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later.